Hi, it's August 8th, and this is my final 2024 Atlantic hurricane season forecast for the year. I've made 3 of these now. This one is the third. The other 2 are in April and May, and this will be updating my forecast as we go through peak season and towards the end of hurricane season in November. So we'll be touching on season activity we've seen so far in June and July, and even early August with Hurricane Debbie. And we'll also be talking about what we can expect numbers-wise when I'm forecasting about the rest of hurricane season. And we'll also look at some climatological aspects and how those are performing compared to what we had forecast a few months ago. Before I go into any form of forecast discussion, just an important point to get made first. This is my own unofficial forecast. This is my own thoughts put into a presentation. I'm not with any official agency. If you want to see the official hurricane season forecast from NOAA, you can go to their website. They have released theirs today, and their forecast is similar to mine for an active Atlantic hurricane season. The other one is that hurricane season forecast isn't an exact science, and I can't sit here and tell you, how many tropical storms or hurricanes are going to form in a year, especially now. I can't tell you how many storms are going to form exactly between now and November. And I also can't tell you where those storms are going to go. I can make a good guess, and I do have an educated guess of where I think storm tracks are more likely this year as we go through peak season. But the most important thing is that you're prepared either way. Even if a storm doesn't hit you this year, you're prepared for next year, and you're prepared for the next year. It doesn't matter if you have a hyperactive season forecast or if you have a below average hurricane season forecast. You still need to be prepared just in case a storm does hit, because it only takes one storm in any season to make a season devastating. And I'm sure a lot of people in the Caribbean can say that with Beryl. They don't need any more storms after Beryl, and hopefully we don't get any more storms hitting there this year. But we're in peak season now, so we got to be prepared for what's to come. Now, so far the hurricane season has been very active. This is the current observed activity compared to average by the state, August 8th. You can see that so far we've had 4 tropical storms. That's Alberto, Beryl, Chris, and Debbie. 2 of those became hurricanes, those being Beryl and Debbie, and only one of those, which is Beryl, became a major hurricane, and a Category 5 hurricane at that. The earliest Category 5 hurricane on record in the Atlantic, beating out Emily of 2005 by about 2 weeks. As compared to the average by the state of 3 tropical storms, no hurricanes, and no major hurricanes, and about 12 ACE. It's probably around 12 ACE now. This number, I think, is from August 5th. So you average about 12 ACE by this time of year. Now, the first hurricane on average forms around August 11th. The first major hurricane forms around September 1st. And in terms of ACE, we're about 348% of normal ACE as of the recording of this video on August the 8th. So very active hurricane season so far. And indications are that we're going to be seeing this activity continue. This was my May forecast, and overall things have not changed all too much with my August forecast. But you can see this very active hurricane season forecast, forecasting 19 to 23 tropical storms, 9 to 13 of those becoming hurricanes, 3 to 7 of those hurricanes becoming major hurricanes, and a seasonal ACE total of 160 to 220. And that's compared to the climatological averages from 1991 to 2020 of 14 storms, 7 hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes, and 123 units of ACE. Now, this is a May forecast, and overall, like I said, the forecast this month has not changed. The biggest change is with accumulated cyclone energy, because we've seen significant activity already in the hurricane season. In May, I went 160 to 220, which the average ACE with my analog year package is around 200 to 220, I believe. And I was more comfortable going lower because we hadn't seen what June and July had offered. But now that we've seen what June and July have offered and what they've done, I've now upped the total to 180 to 240 seasonal ACE when all things are all said and done as we exit out hurricane season in November. And you can see the total tropical storm and hurricane forecast is the exact same. We're still expecting 19 to 23 total storms. Now, this is including the 4 we've already had, so that's 15 to 19 additional tropical storms from here on out, 7 to 11 additional hurricanes from here on out, and 3 to 6 major hurricanes from here on out. I have upped the low end of major hurricanes because of Beryl, but the ACE is the biggest change, and now it's much more in line with the average ACE of the analog package, which we'll look at that updated analog package in just a moment. And I feel more comfortable going with these higher numbers given the activity we've seen. And I have also increased the activity probabilities, now 95% of an above average hurricane season. And it's very likely that we're going to be seeing something get close or even exceed hyperactivity, which is 160 units of ACE. Now, if we look at the climatological factors for hurricane season, of course, the sea surface temperature anomaly map is the big picture of what we look at really to start with hurricane season, as the oceans can give you a lot of information on what can happen over the next few months, as the oceans take a while to lose their heat and gain heat. Really, they take a lot longer than the atmosphere, say, like over the United States, to change. So generally what you have in place, say in June, July, August, will tend to remain the case throughout peak of hurricane season in August, September, and October. You now don't need another refresher of it, but I'll say it again. The Atlantic is record warm right now. You can see that purple contour is any anomalies 1.5 degrees Celsius or higher above normal. And you can see much of the Atlantic is at or above that threshold. And we have still this remaining positive AMO horseshoe where we have warm anomalies near Atlantic Canada moving down through the Azores and curving down into the Caribbean around the Lesser Antilles and Puerto Rico. That's a positive AMO signature. We can also see some more cooler anomalies near Bermuda and off the U.S. East Coast, more highlighting that favorable Atlantic tripole mode, which goes into the AMO. And this has been persistent for about a year now. We've had a very warm Atlantic for a year. And of course, last year was very active, even with an El Nino. But the difference between this year and last year is we have a La Nina taking place. You can see that we have cooler anomalies across the equatorial Pacific. This is not a roaring El Nino that we had last year. This is now turning into a cold neutral to La Nina. Now, admittedly, this has been going through some changes throughout the past few months. You might remember a few months ago, we talked about models wanting a roaring La Nina by this time, yet we're really only in neutral for this time of year. If we look at the graph from Tropical Tidbits, you can see that we're just hovering in cold neutral right now. We've had a couple instances where we were hovering around warm neutral, but right now we're in cold bias neutral, but we're neither in El Nino nor La Nina. And the current expectation is that we're going to be hovering around this cold bias neutral, maybe weak La Nina as we go through peak of hurricane season. You can see this in the forecast from the SANSIP. This is this month's run. You can see the trends of the La Nina going from a roaring La Nina this month to a more cold bias neutral or weak La Nina. And if we look at the current European model forecast, you can see their average is showing a cold bias neutral in line with the SANSIP's model. And if we look at the new forecast issued by NOAA today, you can see they're keeping odds of a La Nina during peak season, which is ASO August, September, and October, about 50-50 right now. And I'd say that's fair given what we've seen with the La Nina. It's clearly not evolving to what climate models had wanted for this time of year. And I think we can go to La Nina later, but I don't think for peak of hurricane season, we're going to be looking at a strong roaring La Nina anymore. Now, this has made some changes to the analog years. You might remember some of these years from my last forecast, and none of these years have changed. All same 6 years here listed are still within the analog package. The difference is with the La Nina, and some analogs have gotten better, some have gotten worse. The red ones are the ones that have gotten worse, like 2010 and 1998. These years had stronger La Ninas, more central based, and I'll go into detail on that in a little bit. But years like 1995, 2005, and 2020, they had weaker La Ninas overall and were a bit more east-based in their cold water. And now this is the rearranged analog package. Again, the years are all the same, but I've just rearranged them. And now the top 3 analogs, which we're going to be looking at a lot over the next few slides, are 2005, 1995, and 2020, which are unfortunately some of the most active hurricane seasons we've had within this current active era since 1995. And if we compare the sea surface temperature anomaly plots from August, September, and October from all of these years, focus on the top row, which is the top three, you can see that we have this weaker Nina, especially in 2005 and 1995. A weaker Nina, not really too cold south of Hawaii, which is where the Nino 3.4 region is. That's what determines El Nino or La Nina. And we're weaker in the central part, and we're more focused with colder water closer to South America, south of the East Pacific, compared to years on the bottom row like 2010 and 1998, where we had roaring La Ninas, more central based, a lot more cold water south of Hawaii. Now, I talked about central based and east based here, and it's important because if you look at the SANSIP's model forecast, this is a sea temperature anomaly plot, like I showed just a few slides ago. You'll note that now the cold water is focusing on this model run closer to South America. And, this becomes a question. Okay, we're not expecting a roaring La Nina. Could that have any impact on the hurricane season being maybe a little bit less active, maybe a little bit less favorable than anticipated, say, a few months ago? Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. And it's an interesting study, certainly, that, years like 2005, that was not a strong La Nina. That was cold bias neutral. And we had one of the most active hurricane seasons on record from that. Whereas, 2010, it was still hyperactive, but nowhere near the amount of activity we had in 2005. I'm going off of ACE index there, that is. So it's a fascinating thing to take into account. And if you think about it, it does sort of make sense why perhaps a cold bias neutral could be more favorable for the Atlantic. Of course, there are different variations of it. You could have maybe just weaker cold anomalies in the Central Pacific, and you have maybe some warmer anomalies. I believe it's called a Modiki. I don't know exactly how you say that word, La Nina, and that can sometimes cause some strange outcomes in the East Pacific and the Atlantic. But in general, if you think about it with a weaker La Nina, like I said, you determine an El Nino and a La Nina by the anomalies south of Hawaii in Nino 3.4. So if you tend to have weaker anomalies there, not quite reaching La Nina, you tend to have more cold water east of there. At least that assumption can be made. And what you can get from that, and this was an effect of the El Nino last year we had as well. That was an east-based El Nino. That caused a lot of rising air over the Pacific and really caused the Caribbean last year to be dead in the Atlantic, despite all the activity we had. It could have an opposite effect with a La Nina. If you have colder water further east, closer to South America, it can focus the sinking cell. So you see those warmer colors on the right plot. That's sinking air, that's dry air, not favorable for tropical cyclone development. And it's focused over the East Pacific. Now, if we compare this to the map of the top 5 years, which includes those central base Ninas of 2010 and 1998, you'll see that this sinking cell is more focused west, south of Hawaii, and there is still a lot of sinking, certainly, over the East Pacific, but it's not as focused over that basin. So, my thinking is, if we have a weaker La Nina, you tend to have cooler waters here, and because you have that increased sinking motion over the East Pacific, it doesn't allow the East Pacific any real big opportunity to steal the rising air from the Atlantic, and it allows the Atlantic to take it all for itself. You can see that even in the top 5 years, because we do have the aspects of like 2005, 1995, and 2020 with those more east-based sinking cells, we do have anomalous rising air in the Atlantic. And if we look at so far this year, this is the velocity potential for May, June, and July. We've had a very prominent sinking cell right over the Pacific, and this has caused the Pacific to have one of its most inactive hurricane seasons on record. As it stands as of August 8th, the season has, I believe, 5 tropical storms, 1 hurricane, and no major hurricanes. It's one of the least active Pacific hurricane seasons we have ever seen in the historical records. And this sinking cell can absolutely be a leading cause for that. And this could also be, one potential reason why, a storm like Beryl was able to get so strong in July. If you have more sinking air here, you have higher pressure than normal across this part of the Pacific, and that can increase the westerly anomalies across the Caribbean, maybe slowing down the trades a little bit more. Now, the trades were still strong, But maybe that helped, as well as easterly anomalies that you typically get in the upper levels. Maybe that helped Beryl a little bit become such a strong storm so early in the Caribbean. Now, if we compare the top 3 searing patterns to what we expect for this year, you can see in the mean 500 millibar height anomaly plot with the sea level pressure, you can see that we generally had higher pressure across the U.S. East Coast and Atlantic Canada. This generally favored a lot more storms coming towards the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. You can see we have that big purple blob in the Gulf of Mexico. And that correlates well to a lot of the storms we had in years like 2005 with Katrina, Wilma, Rita. A lot of storms went into the Gulf of Mexico there. Now, there have been cases, there's some cases where you have storms that still do make it out into the East Coast. Of course, this is an average. There can be some points where you have maybe more troughiness over the East Coast that may allow a storm to recurve at times. And we certainly saw that as well in years like 2005. Now, if we compare this to the top 5, you'll note that we still have similar track anomalies with those sea level pressure, but note we have a lot more tracks focused out to sea through Bermuda up to Atlantic Canada. And that's because we had more low pressure in these analog years over Atlantic Canada, more of a negative NAO pattern where you have lower pressure across Atlantic Canada. A positive AMO is the opposite of that, and that's what we've had this year with higher pressure across Atlantic Canada. And that has likely helped all these storms that you can see in those red lines track west to the Caribbean and into the Gulf of Mexico. So now we're kind of at this question of, which one do we think is going to come true? What we've had so far this year, like I can show you here, we've had high pressure across Atlantic Canada for much of May, June, and July. And that has allowed, again, storms to come west in a lot of cases. Like in all the storms we've had this year, they've all been in the Gulf of Mexico. If we look at climate model forecasts, we can see a similar pattern forecast to remain through August, September, and October. Now, of course, remember, this can still change, and there can still be smaller details of like, hey, maybe there's a trough one week, and it still causes a storm to go out to sea. But the average of all these months is having higher pressure over Atlantic Canada. And we do see some lower pressure anomalies showing up in the East Coast on both the sand steps and the European, but these models also still have a lot of tracks that come into the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. And this type of pattern is much more similar to years like 2005, 2020, 1995, compared to what we had in years like 2010 and 1998. And so with that, this is what I expect for tracks as we go throughout the rest of hurricane season. This has changed a little bit since my last presentation, not all too much though. You can see that the general idea is the same. I expect storms to come off of Africa as tropical waves. It may take a little bit for them to develop, or they may develop, quicker. Depending on that could change the track in the longer term. But either way, I expect that we could have a lot of storms tracking into the Caribbean, and from there they could either go into Central America. And depending on the pattern further north, it could also come into the Gulf of Mexico. And we've certainly seen that already with storms like Beryl and Debbie. And the other one is, I think, if storms do get stronger earlier in the MDR, which certainly is a possibility here as we go through the next few months, I think we could be seeing storms come north of the Caribbean islands when they get stronger, they do tend to recurve out to sea. And we could see storms coming close to, say, the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, U.S. East Coast, Bermuda, and Atlantic Canada. And I also would expect, storms that come out of, say, the Caribbean into the Gulf, they could also recurve and come into, the eastern United States. And we could also see some storms that maybe form offshore, though the anomalies aren't overly warm, so I wouldn't imagine this potential was overly high. So I don't know if we're getting too much spam tropical storms in the subtropics. I think will mainly be in the tropical Atlantic here. But that's all that I've got for this updated forecast. Thanks for watching, and I'll have another video later today as we have a couple systems to watch in the tropics. We've got Typhoon Maria and another system in the Atlantic to watch as we're getting closer to that active period. So we'll advertise for late August. But again, thank you for watching. We'll see how the forecast pans out and hope for the best. But of course, be prepared just in case a hurricane does come your way. That's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching.